Ahmed, the quiet suburban neighbor, Zara, the vigilant synagogue volunteer, and Tariq, the mysterious stranger who vanished without a trace together. They were caught in a chain of events that would shock Sydney, ignite fears of ISIS in Australia, and force Prime Minister Albanese to take unprecedented action. What really happened at Bondi Beach that bright morning? And how far did the threat really reach? Bondi Beach had always been a symbol of Australia, its relaxed lifestyle a place where the golden sand met the sparkling blue waves, where families, tourists, and surfers mingled freely under the warm sun. On that seemingly ordinary morning, the streets were alive with laughter, the smell of fresh coffee from nearby cafes, and the distant calls of seagulls. Children played near the shoreline, joggers traced the promenade, and vendors set up their colorful stalls, unaware that within moments, the rhythm of everyday life would be violently disrupted. At precisely 10:15 a.m., a single figure emerged from a nearby alley. The man moved quickly, almost deliberately blending into the morning crowd. Witnesses described him as wearing dark clothing, with his face partially obscured by a scarf. Without warning, the quiet hum of the city was shattered by the sharp, terrifying sound of gunfire. Chaos erupted instantly. People screamed and ran in every direction, abandoning beach towels, bicycles, and shopping bags. The once cheerful promenade became a scene of panic, with bodies darting behind parked cars, kiosks, and fences. The attacker's target became immediately clear: a small, historic synagogue situated just a block away from the main beach area. Those inside were caught off guard, some trying to hide behind pews and furniture, while others attempted to escape through narrow side doors. The gunman's movements were precise and purposeful, as though he had studied the area beforehand. Shoppers and passers-by were not spared. The indiscriminate shooting sent innocent bystanders scrambling for cover, leaving chaos in every corner of the street. Police were alerted within minutes. Sirens blared as multiple units converged on the area. Helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting live footage of the scene, while patrol cars blocked off streets to prevent further harm. Emergency responders navigated the panicked crowd, guiding people to safety and attending to the injured. Social media erupted with footage captured by terrified witnesses' videos of people diving behind cars, dropping their belongings, and pleading for help flooded the internet within moments, spreading shock and fear far beyond Bondi. Authorities initially described the event as a lone wolf attack, but questions immediately arose. Was this an isolated incident or part of a larger, more sinister plot? Analysts began speculating about potential extremist involvement, and the possibility of ISIS influence was whispered in media reports. Citizens who had felt safe in their communities now found themselves questioning the very nature of security in Australia as most iconic beachside neighborhoods. Amid the chaos, local residents displayed remarkable courage. Shopkeepers helped guide trapped individuals to safety, surfers used their boards to shield frightened bystanders, and strangers supported one another through the terror. Yet, the sense of normalcy that had defined Bondi Beach was gone. For many, the attack was not just a violent act against a specific group. It was a direct challenge to the sense of peace and openness that Australians had long taken for granted. By the end of the day, the gunman had vanished into the city, leaving behind a trail of destruction, fear, and unanswered questions. The serene morning had turned into a nightmare, and the nation watched in stunned silence as authorities scrambled to piece together what had just occurred. Bondi Beach, once a symbol of carefree life and sunshine, had become the epicenter of a terrifying new reality, one that would force the city and the country to confront the possibility of global terror striking on Australian soil. The morning after the attack, Sydney was a city on edge. Streets that were usually alive with chatter and movement now felt tense and quiet. Police cordons stretched across key areas of Bondi, while armed officers patrolled the vicinity of the synagogue and surrounding neighborhoods. Investigators worked tirelessly, examining the scene for clues that might explain how a single individual had been able to strike so suddenly and vanish without a trace. Every detail mattered: shell casings, footprints, CCTV footage, and eyewitness accounts were meticulously collected and analyzed. Surveillance cameras in nearby shops and streets captured fragments of the attacker's movements, but the footage was grainy, showing only glimpses of a masked figure moving with purpose. Analysts noticed patterns suggesting premeditation. The escape route was carefully chosen, the timing precise, and the attack targeted not just a building, but a community. The gunman had clearly studied the area and the people he intended to harm. Authorities began piecing together a timeline, trying to track his steps before and after the shooting, but each lead seemed to dissolve into more questions than answers. Simultaneously, digital investigations were launched. Police scoured social media, encrypted messaging apps, and online forums, searching for any trace of extremist communication. Analysts found disturbing messages and posts, filled with rhetoric supporting violence and hatred, but linking them directly to the gunman was a challenge. The attacker's digital footprint was scattered, deliberate, and hard to trace, another indication of careful planning. Experts suggested that this might not be the work of a local criminal acting alone, but someone influenced or guided by international extremist networks. The public, meanwhile, was desperate for information. News outlets covered every development in real time, broadcasting the fear and uncertainty sweeping through the city. Citizens shared videos of the attack and their own experiences on social media, some seeking help, others warning the community. As speculation about foreign influence grew, the term ISIS began to appear in headlines, creating panic among residents and amplifying the sense that the threat was not just local, but global. Amid the growing anxiety, investigators discovered that the gunman had interacted with people in his community who were previously considered trustworthy. These contacts, unknown to the public, had shared extremist content online and may have assisted in logistical planning. While no formal organization was yet identified, authorities feared the attack was just the beginning, a signal that extremist ideology had quietly penetrated parts of Australian society. The intensity of the investigation drew criticism and praise in equal measure. Some argued that the government and police had acted too slowly to prevent the attack, while others commended the swift, coordinated response after the fact. Security measures were tightened across Sydney. Schools, public transport hubs, and places of worship increased patrols and surveillance. Citizens were advised to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity, creating an atmosphere of heightened awareness and underlying fear. Every new lead seemed to deepen the mystery. The gunman remained unidentified, his motives only partially understood, and the extent of his connections unknown. As detectives worked through the tangled web of digital and physical evidence, one thing became clear: the Bondi shooting was not a random act of violence. It was a deliberate attack that challenged the safety of a city, forced its people to confront uncomfortable truths, and marked the beginning of an investigation that would uncover dark and hidden elements of Australian life. As the investigation deepened, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Forensic analysts discovered digital traces linking the gunman to individuals far beyond Australia's shores. Encrypted messages, deleted social media accounts, and anonymous online posts painted a picture of someone who had been quietly absorbing extremist ideology for months, perhaps even years. Experts warned that the attacker was not acting purely out of personal grievance. He had been influenced by global networks, ones that used the internet to radicalize and recruit individuals from remote corners of the world. Authorities traced some communications to Middle Eastern servers, where ISIS-affiliated accounts were known to operate. Although no formal operational ties were immediately confirmed, the nature of the content was unmistakable. Calls for violence, guidance on planning attacks, and detailed instructions on how to avoid detection. Analysts noted the subtlety of the propaganda. It was not overtly violent in the beginning, but it preyed on vulnerability, gradually convincing the target that radical action was necessary. The gunman's movements, planning, and timing reflected the careful indoctrination that such networks specialized in. At the same time, investigators began uncovering small but significant local links. Certain acquaintances and community members appeared to have provided indirect support-sharing extremist material, offering minor logistical assistance, or simply turning a blind eye to concerning behavior. These discoveries sent shockwaves through Sydney. The notion that someone in a familiar, everyday environment could harbor radical ideas unsettled the public. Ordinary suburban streets, once considered safe, now seemed like potential breeding grounds for hidden threats. Authorities also began studying patterns in the gunman's life: late-night internet activity, unexplained absences, and sudden changes in behavior. Friends and neighbors described him as quiet but unremarkable, a person who blended seamlessly into daily life. Yet beneath this ordinary exterior, he had absorbed a dangerous ideology that could be triggered into violent action. Investigators realized that identifying potential extremists before they acted was far more complicated than anticipated. The online world had given dangerous individuals both anonymity and access to radical networks. Meanwhile, political leaders were alerted to the possibility of an emerging domestic threat tied to foreign extremism. Security agencies emphasized that the attack was not necessarily the work of a fully organized group, but even lone actors, influenced remotely, could cause devastating harm. This revelation sparked intense debates within the government about the balance between privacy and surveillance, freedom and security. Questions arose. How could authorities detect radicalization early? How could they prevent ideologies from crossing borders digitally and manifesting as violent acts on local streets? As public anxiety grew, experts warned that the attack might inspire copycats. The gunman had struck swiftly and decisively, leaving fear in his wake. News coverage, viral videos, and online discussions only amplified his influence. It became clear that extremism was no longer a distant threat. It had penetrated communities, infiltrated networks, and exploited modern technology to reach susceptible individuals. Australia, like many countries, was confronting a reality it had long hoped to avoid: that global terrorism could take root quietly, waiting for the moment to erupt in violence. By the end of the week, investigators had a clearer picture, but far fewer answers than they wanted. The gunman's motives were partially understood, but the depth of his connections and the potential for future attacks remained unknown. Sydney, a city that prided itself on openness and safety, now faced a stark and unsettling truth. Extremism could emerge silently, adapt quickly, and strike anywhere, even in the heart of everyday life. The Bondi shooting did more than terrify the public. It sent shockwaves through the halls of Parliament. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese found himself at the center of an unprecedented political crisis. Overnight, what had seemed like a localized act of violence became a national issue, forcing politicians, security agencies, and the public to confront questions that had long been avoided. How safe was Australia from the spread of extremism? And had the government underestimated the threat? Albanese faced intense scrutiny. Opposition parties accused him of negligence, claiming that intelligence agencies had failed to detect the rising radicalization within local communities. Media outlets dissected every decision made by the Prime Minister's office, from funding allocations for counterterrorism programs to the effectiveness of digital surveillance measures. The public demanded answers, flooding hotlines and social media platforms with urgent questions about what was being done to prevent another attack. Citizens no longer trusted that the familiar streets of Sydney or anywhere in the country were safe from the influence of global extremist networks. Within hours, the Prime Minister convened an emergency security meeting. Heads of intelligence, law enforcement, and national security agencies briefed him on the evolving investigation. They warned that the gunman's links to extremist ideology were likely part of a broader pattern. While the attack had been carried out by one individual, The networks behind him had the potential to influence others, creating a ripple effect of violence and fear. The pressure on Albanese was immense. He needed to act decisively, yet avoid overstepping the legal and civil rights boundaries that defined Australian democracy. Albanese announced immediate measures to strengthen national security. Public messaging emphasized vigilance, reporting suspicious activity, and increased protection for religious and public institutions. Simultaneously, government agencies began preparing legislation to expand counter-terrorism powers, including monitoring of digital communications and the ability to detain individuals suspected of planning extremist acts. The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some praised the swift action as necessary to protect citizens, while civil rights advocates warned of potential overreach and infringement on privacy. The political storm intensified as debates spilled into Parliament. Opposition leaders accused Albanese of reacting too slowly to global threats and argued that funding for intelligence had been insufficient. Supporters countered that the Prime Minister's response had been measured and focused, balancing security needs with democratic principles. Meanwhile, public opinion was divided. Australians were united in fear and outrage, but tension grew over how far the government should go to prevent future attacks without eroding freedoms. Amid the political turmoil, investigators continued their work. Every new discovery about the gunman's digital communications, local contacts, and potential supporters heightened the urgency for decisive government action. Albanese's office faced daily questions about whether Australia was prepared to combat domestic radicalization and whether the measures being proposed could prevent another attack before it happened. The Prime Minister's decisions over the coming weeks would shape public trust, national security strategy, and the way Australians viewed the balance between freedom and safety. By the end of the week, it was clear that the Bondi shooting had become more than a criminal investigation. It had become a political crucible. Albanese's leadership was under scrutiny, and the nation was grappling with uncomfortable truths about extremism, safety, and the role of government. Sydney, still recovering from the attack, watched closely as the Prime Minister navigated a storm that had no easy answers and far-reaching consequences. Just when authorities believed they were beginning to piece the puzzle together, a startling revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The gunman, who had seemed like a lone figure influenced only by distant extremist networks, was discovered to have connections much closer to home. Among his circle of acquaintances were individuals who, on the surface, appeared ordinary and trustworthy neighbors, co-workers, and even community volunteers. Yet behind the facade of normalcy, some had quietly supported his radicalization, providing resources and guidance that went unnoticed by those around him. Forensic analysis of financial records revealed unexplained transactions. Small amounts of money had flowed into the gunman's accounts, sent by people who claimed to be helping with everyday expenses. But investigators suspected that these funds were used to purchase equipment and materials for planning the attack. The discovery stunned both authorities and the public. The idea that someone in a seemingly quiet suburban neighborhood could have been harboring extremist sympathies challenged long-held assumptions about safety and trust. Further investigation uncovered subtle signs of complicity. Digital footprints indicated that the gunman had received advice on tactical planning from an anonymous figure in his community, someone who had intimate knowledge of the area, escape routes, and the daily routines of local residents. This revelation added a chilling dimension to the case. The attack had not been entirely isolated, and the planning had benefited from insider knowledge that allowed the gunman to strike quickly and disappear without immediate capture. Community members, meanwhile, were in disbelief. People who had interacted with the gunman regularly described him as quiet, polite, and even helpful. There were no outward signs of extremism, no overt indicators that he posed a threat. The investigation exposed the frightening reality that radicalization could occur in plain sight, hidden beneath layers of everyday normality. Families, friends, and neighbors began questioning everything they thought they knew, wondering if someone they trusted could harbor dangerous intentions. Authorities realized that uncovering these hidden networks was critical to preventing future attacks. Raids on residences and digital devices revealed additional evidence of extremist materials, encrypted communications, and instructions for carrying out violent acts. Investigators theorized that while the gunman had acted alone in execution, his actions had been enabled by an invisible support system composed of individuals who blended seamlessly into ordinary life. This network was sophisticated, careful, and patient, making detection incredibly difficult. The revelation prompted a renewed sense of urgency in government circles. Security agencies emphasized that domestic radicalization could not be dismissed as isolated incidents. Even those who appeared harmless could be influenced by global, extremist ideologies and provide support to dangerous individuals. Public safety campaigns began focusing not only on identifying potential attackers, but also on recognizing early signs of radicalization within communities. As the investigation continued, the public grappled with a harsh truth. Terror could emerge from familiar places, not just foreign threats. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety, proving that violence could be incubated quietly in the heart of society. The story of the Bondi shooting was no longer just about a single gunman. It had become a tale of hidden alliances, secret support networks, and the unsettling realization that danger could be closer than anyone imagined. Sydney, and indeed the entire nation, was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that safety and trust were far more fragile than they had ever believed. In the days following the shocking revelations about the gunman's local connections, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese acted decisively. A nationwide security crackdown was launched, the likes of which Australia had rarely seen. Police forces, intelligence agencies, and counter-terror units coordinated a series of raids across multiple states, targeting homes, businesses, and digital networks suspected of harboring extremist activities. Every action was meticulously planned, aiming to dismantle hidden cells before they could strike. The crackdown signaled a new level of urgency, showing that the government was prepared to confront domestic radicalization head-on. The raids yielded startling discoveries. Weapons caches, explosives, and extremist propaganda were found in homes that appeared ordinary from the outside. Computers, phones, and storage devices contained encrypted communications with foreign networks, indicating that the threat extended far beyond the confines of suburban neighborhoods. Authorities were shocked by the sophistication and organization of some of the materials. They suggested a level of planning that could have enabled multiple attacks if left unchecked. The realization that such dangerous resources had been quietly accumulated in everyday communities sent shockwaves through the nation. Intelligence agencies worked around the clock to decrypt messages and trace communications. Analysts found evidence of attempts to recruit others within Australia, exploiting social media platforms, online forums, and messaging apps. Even as raids progressed, authorities emphasized that radicalization was subtle and ongoing, with individuals often hiding their true intentions behind ordinary lives. The discovery that extremists could operate undetected in local communities created an atmosphere of heightened vigilance. Families, neighbors, and entire suburbs were suddenly scrutinized, and the sense of security that Australians had long taken for granted was shaken. The government's crackdown was not limited to physical raids. Albanese authorized expanded surveillance of online activities, monitoring for signs of extremist influence and suspicious communications. Immigration and customs departments tightened border controls, reviewing the travel histories and networks of individuals suspected of spreading radical ideologies. The Prime Minister assured the public that measures were temporary but necessary, stressing that vigilance was the key to preventing further tragedies. Civil liberties groups voiced concerns about privacy and government overreach, sparking heated debates about the balance between safety and freedom. Public reaction was a mix of relief and anxiety. Many Australians felt reassured that authorities were taking decisive action, but the visibility of raids and police presence also reminded citizens of the reality of extremism in their own neighborhoods. Schools, public institutions, and places of worship heightened security measures, while community leaders urged calm and vigilance. The sense of normal life had been irrevocably altered, replaced by an awareness that danger could arise from unexpected places. Despite the aggressive crackdown, investigators knew the threat was far from neutralized. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers, revealing a network of hidden supporters and potential attackers that could still be active. Albanese's government remained under pressure to act swiftly and decisively, balancing the need for security with the public's demand for transparency and protection of civil rights. The Bondi shooting, initially perceived as an isolated act, had ignited a nationwide operation that would reshape the way Australians understood domestic security and the challenges posed by global extremism. In the weeks following the Bondi attack, Sydney's streets carried a tension that was impossible to ignore. Residents walked with cautious steps, glancing over their shoulders in crowded areas, unsure of who they could trust. Public spaces that were once hubs of laughter and social activity cafes, markets, and parks now felt charged with unease. Parents hesitated to let their children play freely, and commuters remained alert, scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. The attack had not just targeted a religious community. It had unsettled an entire city, leaving citizens uncertain about the very foundations of their daily lives. Jewish communities, in particular, took immediate measures to safeguard themselves. Synagogues installed reinforced doors, private security was hired, and community members attended classes on emergency preparedness. Even casual visits to local shops or walking along familiar streets became exercises in vigilance. Faith and tradition had not disappeared, but the freedom to practice them without fear had been significantly curtailed. People spoke in hushed tones about safety protocols and evacuation plans, realizing that everyday routines could no longer be taken for granted. Despite the fear, there were also remarkable displays of resilience. Community leaders organized vigils and awareness campaigns, emphasizing unity in the face of terror. Citizens from different backgrounds came together, lighting candles along the promenade and holding peaceful gatherings that honored victims while asserting that violence would not define their city. Volunteers patrolled public spaces to offer assistance, and neighbors checked on one another, reinforcing the sense that Sydney was determined to remain strong despite the shadows cast by the attack. Schools, workplaces, and public institutions adjusted to the new reality. Emergency drills became routine, security checks were implemented, and counselors provided support to those struggling with anxiety and trauma. Local media highlighted stories of courage, resilience, and solidarity, balancing coverage of fear with narratives of hope. The Bondi shooting had exposed vulnerabilities, but it also revealed the capacity of ordinary citizens to adapt, protect one another, and refuse to succumb entirely to terror. Social media played a dual role in this period. While it amplified fear and rumors, it also allowed citizens to communicate warnings, share verified information, and coordinate community initiatives. Neighbors exchanged tips on safe routes, parents discussed protective measures for their children, and volunteers spread word of emergency resources. The city, in a sense, became more interconnected, not just digitally, but socially, as people realized that survival required cooperation and vigilance. Yet beneath the surface of unity, anxiety persisted. Every unexplained noise, every stranger lingering too long, and every report of suspicious activity triggered panic. Mental health professionals warned that prolonged fear could have lasting consequences, potentially leading to overcautious behavior or mistrust within communities. Australians were learning that resilience did not mean the absence of fear. It meant continuing life despite it, taking precautions, and refusing to let terror dictate everyday actions. By the end of the month, Sydney was slowly finding its rhythm again, but it was a rhythm marked by vigilance. The Bondi shooting had left an indelible mark, reshaping the social fabric, altering routines, and forcing a city to confront the delicate balance between fear and resilience. The attack had succeeded in creating shock, but it had also sparked a determination among citizens to reclaim their streets, protect one another, and assert that life, while forever changed, would continue. The gunman had been captured, but the investigation revealed that the story was far from over. Authorities discovered that the individual who carried out the Bondi attack was only a single piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle. Traces of communications, unexplained contacts, and financial transfers hinted at the possibility of additional operatives, people who could still be planning or supporting attacks from the shadows. The notion that the threat had not been fully neutralized sent a shiver through Sydney, and the nation braced itself for the unsettling possibility that what had happened at Bondi was only the beginning. Experts emphasized that radicalization could continue quietly, often unnoticed, until it erupted into violence. The gunman's ability to operate undetected for months, accumulating weapons and planning meticulously, demonstrated the danger of ideologies spreading in silence. Authorities warned that global extremist networks had adapted to modern technology, using encrypted platforms and social media to reach vulnerable individuals without ever physically stepping foot in Australia. For many citizens, this revelation was alarming. The enemy was no longer visible, and the threat could exist in homes, workplaces, and schools across the country. Prime Minister Albanese's crackdown had disrupted networks, confiscated weapons, and exposed hidden supporters, but intelligence officials acknowledged that challenges remained. Identifying those influenced by radical ideas required constant vigilance, careful analysis, and, in some cases, difficult ethical decisions. Communities were encouraged to remain alert, yet the line between caution and paranoia was thin. People had to navigate a delicate balance, protecting themselves and others without succumbing to fear that could fracture neighborhoods and erode trust. As the cities slowly returned to a semblance of normal life, the psychological aftermath became evident. Survivors, witnesses, and community members struggled with trauma, replaying the violence and chaos in their minds. Mental health professionals worked tirelessly, but the invisible scars of fear persisted. Sydney had experienced a profound shift. Ordinary streets and familiar spaces were no longer automatically associated with safety. Even as families resumed routines, a heightened awareness lingered, reminding everyone that the threat had been real, immediate, and potentially recurring. International experts monitored the situation closely, noting that the Bondi shooting had broader implications. Australia was not alone in facing the spread of global extremism within its borders, but the event highlighted the unique challenges of detecting and preventing lone actor attacks influenced remotely. Governments, communities, and law enforcement agencies worldwide drew lessons from Sydney, realizing that vigilance, intelligence sharing, and public cooperation were essential to addressing a threat that was constantly evolving. In the end, the Bondi attack became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. The gunman's capture did not erase the fear, but it reinforced the determination of a city and a nation to confront extremism decisively. Sydney had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Danger could come from familiar places. Ideologies could travel across continents invisibly, and the line between safety and threat was far thinner than anyone had imagined. Yet, amid uncertainty and anxiety, there remained a resolve to reclaim the city's streets, preserve life, and remain vigilant against threats that might emerge at any moment. As the sun set over the coastline, casting long shadows across Bondi Beach, one truth remained clear. The attack had ended, but the questions it raised about extremism, security, and human vulnerability were far from answered. Australia had survived the nightmare, but the story of the Bondi shooting and the shadow it left on the nation was an unfinished chapter in the ongoing struggle against unseen dangers that could strike without warning.